In 1972, a group of MIT scientists warned that if humanity kept chasing endless economic growth without accounting for environmental limits, we could face societal collapse by 2040. Their prediction wasn't a wild guess. It came from a computer model that tracked how population, industry, food, and pollution interact over time. Now it's 2025, and a recent KPMG analysis says we're following the business as usual path even more closely than expected. In some areas, we're actually outpacing the original projections, with certain indicators trending worse than the baseline. With just 15 years until the MIT model's predicted collapse window, it's worth asking, how did they come up with these numbers in the first place? The original MIT Doomsday model. The foundation for all these predictions was the World 3 model, developed at MIT in the early 1970s. This was one of the first large-scale attempts to use computers to simulate the long-term consequences of exponential growth on a finite planet. The World 3 model tracked 5 global variables: population, industrial output, food production, resource availability, and pollution. These weren't isolated data points. Instead, the model mapped out how each factor influenced the others through feedback loops, where a change in one area could set off a chain reaction that circled back to amplify the original problem. Even with the limited computing power of the time, the researchers were able to program World 3 to reflect the complex nonlinear relationships that define real-world systems. For example, if industrial output increased, so did pollution. More pollution could damage crops, which would then impact food production and eventually population growth. These feedback loops were central to the model's projections, showing how small changes could quickly escalate into much larger problems. The MIT team ran 12 different scenarios by tweaking key assumptions, like the pace of technological innovation, rates of resource discovery, and how quickly societies might respond to warning signs. The most optimistic scenario assumed rapid global cooperation and breakthrough technologies that could solve emerging problems as they appeared. Most scenarios, though, reflected more moderate or delayed responses, while the business-as-usual case assumed society would continue on its current path without major interventions. Across the scenarios, the World 3 outputs followed a similar pattern: steady exponential growth in population and industry through the late 20th century, followed by a period of mounting stress as resource depletion and pollution started to bite. The model didn't claim to predict specific dates, but it did show that under most conditions, the tipping point for instability would arrive sometime between 2020 and 2040. The breakdown wasn't imagined as a sudden catastrophe. Instead, the model projected gradually compounding crises, declines in food production, rising pollution, and falling industrial output that would eventually overwhelm society's ability to cope. Technology's influence in the simulations was mixed. In some runs, new inventions helped delay or soften the impacts of resource scarcity and pollution. In others, technological advances simply accelerated extraction and consumption, making underlying problems worse. The researchers were clear that the model couldn't anticipate the exact nature of future innovations. Instead, they focused on how new technologies might interact with the system's basic constraints. What stands out from World 3's results is the emphasis on interconnected stresses. The model rarely showed collapse triggered by a single disaster. More often, it was the accumulation of multiple slow-moving breakdowns across food, resources, and industry that caused societies to falter. Even when surface-level stability continued for a while, the underlying supports were eroding, setting the stage for a sudden loss of resilience. The MIT team's most optimistic scenario required a level of global cooperation and foresight that was unprecedented, even by today's standards. Most of the other paths assumed that recognition of limits would come too late or that responses would be insufficient. The business-as-usual trajectory, in particular, projected a clear pattern of overshoot and collapse, one that, in retrospect, aligns uncomfortably well with several real-world trends. Importantly, the researchers never presented their work as a prophecy. Instead, they viewed the model as a tool for exploring how complex systems might behave under different assumptions. The main insight wasn't about pinpointing exact years for collapse, but about revealing the deep interconnections between population, industry, food, resources, and pollution. Those relationships, they argued, would determine the fate of modern civilization. Half a century later, the question is whether the original model was perfect. It's whether the broad patterns it identified still hold up when tested against real-world data. Recent analyses have taken a fresh look at the MIT projections, comparing them to what's actually happened since the 1970s. 2025 update: Are we ahead of schedule? By 2020, Gaya Harrington, an analyst at KPMG, set out to see how the MIT World 3 model compared to the real world nearly 50 years after its debut. She pulled together data through 2019 and lined it up against the original scenarios. The results were unsettling. Today's global trends most closely follow the business-as-usual 2 scenario, where collapse is driven by pollution overload rather than simple resource exhaustion, as KPMG's findings highlight. Population growth isn't a perfect match, but it's tracking within the projected range. The UN estimates the world population in 2025 at about 8.1 billion. That's a bit below the MIT model's central forecast, but still well within the boundaries where the model's feedback loops apply. The main difference comes from where the growth happens. Developing countries have outpaced the projections, while developed economies have slowed down faster than expected. This has created global imbalances the original model didn't fully anticipate. Industrial output is a sharper indicator. Since 2021, manufacturing has rebounded from pandemic lows to hit new highs, echoing what the business-as-usual scenarios anticipated. Global industrial production grew by around 6% last year, but this growth is concentrated in a handful of manufacturing giants, while other regions lag or stagnate. This uneven expansion increases systemic fragility. One shock in a major hub can ripple through the entire network. Food production presents a more complicated picture. The MIT model expected a direct connection between rising pollution and crop failures. Instead, climate change has introduced unpredictable disruptions, unprecedented droughts in some regions, floods in others. Global grain reserves are now at 30-year lows, not because of a single disaster, but due to a series of overlapping regional crises. The model captured the broad trend, rising food stress, but underestimated how tightly interconnected these problems would become. Resource availability shows the clearest break from 1970s expectations. New extraction technologies have expanded known oil reserves, delaying depletion timelines. But critical minerals, like lithium and rare earth elements, are vanishing faster than the original model anticipated. World 3 treated resources as largely interchangeable, but modern technology has created new bottlenecks and hyperspecific shortages. Pollution data, on the other hand, validates some of MIT's most troubling predictions. Atmospheric CO2 has reached 425 parts per million, exceeding even the business-as-usual trajectory. Microplastics have been found everywhere from Antarctic ice to human tissue. The surprise isn't just the scale of pollution, but the emergence of new contaminants that the original researchers couldn't have foreseen. Since 2021, almost every negative trend has accelerated. Supply chain breakdowns have made resource distribution less reliable. Climate disasters have become more frequent and costly. Political instability has surged in the wake of pandemic disruptions. The model didn't account for black swan events like COVID-19, but its baseline projections now look almost optimistic by comparison. Harrington's update highlights 2 main paths: the comprehensive technology scenario, where innovation eases the landing, and the more pessimistic business-as-usual 2 track. Current data shows elements of both. Renewable energy adoption is advancing faster than expected, which matches the tech scenario. But pollution and inequality trends are closely tracking the collapse trajectory. The food situation is a good example of this split. Advances in agricultural technology have pushed yields beyond what MIT projected. We produce enough to feed billions more. Yet over 800 million people still go hungry, not because of global shortages, but because distribution systems haven't kept up. This is the modern collapse pattern. Isolated solutions exist, but systemic coordination is failing. Resource trends show a similar contradiction. We've found more oil, but fresh water is running out. The Colorado River can't meet its allocations, and major aquifers are nearing exhaustion. Progress in one area is canceled out by decline in another, mirroring the feedback loops the MIT team warned about. Political instability adds new layers. The original model didn't anticipate how social media would amplify polarization or how financial systems would concentrate risk. Since 2021, these forces have accelerated, interacting with older threats in unpredictable ways. Taken together, the alignment between today's data and the MIT projections is difficult to ignore. The timing may shift, but the mechanisms, population pressure, industrial growth, pollution, and resource stress continue to interact as the model described. The technology has changed, but the underlying dynamics remain. As we move further into 2025, these patterns are showing up most clearly in the global economy, where the warning signs are becoming harder to overlook. Economic indicators, the collapse scorecard. Economic signals in 2025 closely mirror the stress points MIT's model anticipated under its business-as-usual scenario. Growth has slowed sharply, with most forecasts showing a clear deceleration across major economies. Instead of steady expansion, we see businesses pulling back on investment and hiring, a pattern that often foreshadows broader stagnation. Unemployment is ticking upward, and the Philadelphia Fed notes that recession signals have tripled since last year. These shifts don't look dramatic in isolation, but together they reveal a system losing momentum. Debt now props up much of the economy. National debt levels keep setting new records, and the reliance on borrowing has become routine rather than exceptional. With the possibility of tariffs rising and fiscal policy tightening, analysts warn that a spike in interest rates could force governments into an austerity trap, where spending cuts and tax hikes are needed just to keep up with debt payments. In the worst-case scenario, this could tip economies into contraction, echoing the constraints MIT's model predicted would eventually limit growth. Supply chains, once seen as a model of efficiency, have become a source of persistent vulnerability. Trade deals stall or unravel, and even the threat of higher tariffs, potentially reaching 25%, creates ripple effects across industries. These disruptions aren't just raising prices, they threaten to shut down entire sectors, much as the original model envisioned when resource bottlenecks began to cascade. The interconnectedness that once made the global economy resilient now amplifies every shock. Inequality continues to widen. The concentration of wealth has accelerated beyond what the MIT team imagined, with the top tier accumulating assets at a rate that leaves most households behind. Housing costs have soared in most urban centers, making homeownership increasingly out of reach for average earners. The original model didn't fully anticipate how financialization would allow capital to accumulate so unevenly, but the result is a system where opportunity narrows even as headline wealth grows. Inflation remains stubborn. Forecasters expect consumer prices to keep rising faster than wages, putting more pressure on household budgets. Central banks try to manage the balance between curbing inflation and supporting growth, but their tools look increasingly blunt. Meanwhile, uncertainty in currency markets grows as investors look for alternatives, not because other currencies are stronger, but because confidence in the status quo keeps eroding. Employment data shows a split reality. On one hand, official unemployment rates remain moderate. On the other, workforce participation has yet to recover, and more people are stringing together multiple jobs to cover basic expenses. This hidden stress surfaces later in declining health outcomes and lower productivity. The volatility in job markets makes employers hesitant, feeding a cycle of caution that slows recovery. Consumer debt is climbing. Credit card balances reach new highs each quarter, while savings rates fall. This isn't driven by luxury spending. It's a reflection of people using debt to cover essentials as real wages lag behind. MIT's model assumed consumer behavior would remain stable, but today's debt-driven survival strategies reveal a more fragile foundation. Financial institutions pass regulatory stress tests, but cracks are visible. Commercial real estate struggles with high vacancy rates, and regional banks merge to avoid insolvency. The system's stability now depends as much on perception as on fundamentals. Everyone senses the risk of a sudden loss of confidence, but few want to be the first to act. The Conference Board's leading economic index has dropped steadily, signaling a likely recession ahead. Weakness spreads across sectors. Manufacturing, construction, and services all show signs of strain. What stands out is the breadth of these warning lights. Instead of isolated trouble spots, nearly every major indicator points to underlying fragility. When measured against MIT's original scenarios, current trends most closely follow the business-as-usual path, where collapse results from a convergence of systemic failures. Economic stress is not coming from a single source, but from an accumulation of pressures. Debt, inflation, inequality, and supply chain breakdowns all interact, just as the model predicted. Borrowing has delayed some impacts, but the underlying stresses are converging. Technological innovation, once expected to offset these risks, has had mixed results. Automation eliminates jobs faster than new sectors can absorb workers. Productivity gains concentrate in a few industries, while others stagnate. The promise of broad-based benefits hasn't materialized, leaving many on the outside looking in. Supply shocks now arrive from unexpected directions. A canal blockage, a drought, or a semiconductor shortage can disrupt entire markets. The complexity of the global system, once a strength, now creates fragility that simple economic models struggle to capture. Resource depletion remains a concern, but the brittleness of trade and finance has become just as critical. All these signals point to an economy entering the danger zone outlined decades ago. This isn't a sudden collapse, but a period where stress compounds and responses lag behind. The The MIT model suggested that this phase would begin around now, intensifying through the coming decade. As the evidence mounts, it's clear that economic fragility is only one part of the larger picture. Environmental crises, accelerating the timeline. Environmental breakdowns now unfold in ways that even the most pessimistic models from the 1970s did not fully anticipate. The World Meteorological Organization recently confirmed that 2024 marked the hottest year on record, with global temperatures reaching nearly 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. This milestone arrives decades ahead of the gradual warming that MIT's World 3 model projected. The last 10 years have each ranked among the warmest ever measured, compressing what was expected to be a slow trend into a single, relentless decade. One of the clearest signals of crisis is the rapid decline of coral reefs. Since 2009, nearly 14% of the world's coral has disappeared, primarily due to warmer, more acidic oceans. These reefs are not just colorful backdrops, they anchor marine food chains and protect coastlines from storms. Their loss signals a breakdown in ecosystem stability, and the pace of die-off outstrips anything the original models foresaw. Deforestation continues at a scale that erases entire ecosystems each year. Human activity has now altered over 70% of ice-free land, with primary forests vanishing fastest. The Amazon and Southeast Asia remain frontlines, but Africa's deforestation rate now matches them, showing that the problem is global rather than regional. The World 3 model anticipated resource depletion, but satellite data reveals forest loss accelerating in areas once considered relatively stable. Climate change acts as a force multiplier for these crises. Extreme weather events have become more frequent and severe. Heat waves last longer and set new records, while tropical storms form earlier and intensify more quickly. Floods and droughts now occur in regions previously thought safe from such extremes. These events disrupt food production, damage infrastructure, and displace communities, amplifying the stress on already fragile systems. Biodiversity loss compounds the problem. Human land use, especially for food production, remains the main driver, but climate change now accelerates the decline. Species extinctions are no longer theoretical, they are happening in real time, with the first climate-driven extinctions already documented. The disappearance of key species destabilizes entire ecosystems, leading to cascading effects that the original MIT researchers could not have fully predicted. Freshwater shortages have reached critical levels in several regions. Major rivers like the Colorado can no longer meet their legal allocations, and aquifers beneath key agricultural zones are being depleted faster than they can recharge. The World 3 model predicted resource constraints, but the speed and concentration of water crises in food-producing regions have exceeded expectations. Pollution adds another layer of complexity. Greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, with coal, oil, and natural gas still the main sources. Microplastics and chemical contaminants now appear in every environment, from mountain peaks to ocean trenches. These pollutants alter ecosystems in ways that go beyond the scope of the original models, introducing new variables and feedback loops. Natural carbon sinks like forests and oceans once absorbed a significant share of emissions, but their capacity is now diminished. As forests burn or die, they release stored carbon instead of capturing it. Warming oceans absorb less CO2, further accelerating atmospheric buildup. These feedbacks amplify the pace of change, making mitigation more difficult with each passing year. The comprehensive technology scenario, where rapid innovation offsets environmental damage, has not materialized at the necessary scale. While renewable energy adoption is growing, fossil fuels still dominate, and carbon capture remains too expensive for broad deployment. Nature-based solutions, such as restoring forests and wetlands, are essential but underfunded and slow to implement compared to the speed of degradation. On nearly every environmental measure, current trends align more closely with the business-as-usual 2 scenario from the MIT model, where pollution and ecosystem breakdown drive declines in food production, health, and economic stability. The feedback loops between environmental and economic systems intensify the risks, creating a landscape where local crises quickly become global shocks. These environmental realities do not exist in isolation. They interact with political and social systems, shaping responses and revealing new vulnerabilities. As the natural world reaches critical thresholds, the strains on governance and cooperation become more visible, setting the stage for the next layer of instability. Political chaos, modern empire fragmentation. Political chaos in 2025 is not confined to isolated regions. It is a global phenomenon that increasingly shapes the world's trajectory. The most pressing geopolitical risks are now concentrated in a handful of hotspots, each with the potential to trigger wider instability. The ongoing war in Ukraine, for instance, has entered a more violent phase, with a 63% increase in battlefield activity compared to the previous year, and steady territorial gains by Russia. Western support for Ukraine is wavering, and the conflict has already redrawn alliances and disrupted global energy markets. At the same time, the risk of escalation in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea remains high, as tensions between China and the United States simmer beneath the surface of diplomatic engagement. The Middle East is another major concern, with the Preventive Priorities survey ranking deteriorating security conditions there as the leading global risk. The region faces persistent fighting in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon, as well as the threat of a wider confrontation involving Iran and Israel. These conflicts are not isolated. They interact with economic pressures, migration flows, and resource competition, amplifying their impact far beyond their immediate borders. Democratic institutions are under strain in many countries. Election disputes have become more common, with losing parties increasingly contesting results and eroding public faith in the process. Legislatures struggle with basic governance, often unable to pass budgets or respond effectively to emerging crises. This gridlock appears in the US Congress and in several European parliaments, where coalition governments collapse over seemingly minor disputes. As societies face more complex problems, political systems are less able to deliver coordinated solutions. International cooperation continues to weaken. The United Nations Security Council remains deadlocked by vetoes, and major trade agreements are repeatedly renegotiated or ignored. Climate accords see little progress, even as environmental crises mount. The World Trade Organization reports a sharp rise in protectionist measures since 2020, reflecting a shift toward nationalism and self-interest. This retreat from multilateralism makes it harder to address problems that cross borders, such as pandemics, cyber threats, and climate change. Nationalist and populist movements have gained ground across continents. Recent elections in Europe, Asia, and the Americas show voters turning toward candidates who promise to prioritize national interests and restrict immigration. Many border restrictions imposed during the pandemic remain in place, and debates over migration dominate political discourse. The rhetoric has shifted from economic arguments to themes of cultural preservation and identity, fueling polarization and making compromise more difficult. Public trust in institutions is at historic lows. Surveys in the United States and Europe show declining confidence in governments, media, and major corporations. Anti-establishment parties capitalize on this disillusionment, drawing support from citizens who no longer believe that traditional systems can solve their problems. As trust erodes, people become more likely to disengage from politics or seek alternative sources of authority. Political polarization now extends beyond policy differences to fundamental disagreements about reality. Populations are divided into groups that operate with separate sets of facts, and social media platforms accelerate this fragmentation. Extreme views are amplified, moderates are sidelined, and compromise becomes rare. Governing becomes more difficult as leaders respond to increasingly divided constituencies, with little room for consensus. Military and cyber conflicts add new layers of risk. Beyond Ukraine, tensions in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, and Middle East create the potential for sudden escalation. Cyberattacks on critical infrastructure have moved from hypothetical to routine, targeting power grids, water systems, and transportation networks. The increasing digitization of essential services makes societies more vulnerable to disruption by both state and non-state actors. Breakdowns in governance are evident in countries facing state collapse, such as Haiti and Lebanon, as well as in stable democracies where basic administration falters. Coups and near-coups in parts of Africa, and persistent legislative dysfunction in wealthier nations point to a broader pattern of institutional stress. These are not isolated failures. They reflect systemic pressures that undermine the ability of political systems to adapt. Compared to what the MIT model anticipated, political instability is unfolding more rapidly and with greater complexity. The model foresaw institutional challenges, but it did not predict how digital media would accelerate division and distrust. Instead of a gradual erosion, many political systems now face rapid fragmentation, with consequences that spill across economic, social, and environmental domains. The forces pulling political systems apart are mirrored in the digital sphere, where platforms designed to connect people increasingly drive them into isolated camps. This fragmentation, once confined to politics, now shapes how societies interact, communicate, and understand the world. Social media and cultural breakdowns. Social media's role in 2025 is to accelerate change and fracture, shaping the ways people form relationships, consume information, and construct identity. Platforms have become engines for both connection and division, their algorithms tuned to maximize engagement, often by promoting the most polarizing or emotionally charged content. Internal platform data shows that users are now nudged toward more extreme material at far higher rates than even 5 years ago. The average person scrolls past hundreds of posts daily, but retains little trading depth for the constant novelty of the feed. The speed and reach of digital communication have transformed not only how people interact, but also how they perceive themselves and their communities. Digital platforms enable new forms of organization. Online groups and forums gather people around shared interests, allowing for solidarity and collaboration that might be impossible offline. For many, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, these digital spaces provide rare opportunities for expression and support. Yet these connections often lack the reciprocity or accountability of physical relationships and rarely translate into sustained real-world engagement. Participation in local organizations and face-to-face community events has declined sharply, replaced by a surge in membership in virtual groups. The impact on mental health is now widely acknowledged. Studies link heavy social media use to higher anxiety rates among teens, and clinical depression has risen across age groups since smartphones became commonplace. The constant connectivity and the pressure to curate an idealized online persona foster a culture of comparison and external validation. Young people in particular spend increasing amounts of time managing their digital identities, often at the expense of developing practical or interpersonal skills. Sleep disorders have become more common as screen time extends late into the night, making it harder for people to disconnect and recharge. Information itself is filtered through algorithmic recommendation systems that create echo chambers. Users are exposed primarily to views and news that reinforce their existing beliefs, making it more difficult to encounter or consider alternatives. Viral misinformation spreads far faster than corrections, and fact-checking organizations find themselves perpetually behind. In moments of crisis, false narratives can reach a majority of users before accurate reports even surface. This dynamic undermines trust in institutions and makes consensus on basic facts nearly impossible. Polarization is no longer a byproduct. It is actively amplified by the very systems that were meant to connect people. Political conversations become more extreme as users are exposed to content specifically selected to provoke strong reactions. The feedback loop between outrage and engagement rewards divisive material, making civil discourse rare and short-lived. Surveys show that people now have fewer friends across political or cultural lines, and intergenerational divides deepen as different age groups inhabit separate digital realities. Cultural exchange happens at unprecedented speed, but with a cost. The same platforms that can make a local artist or trend go global also promote cultural homogenization, where dominant trends overshadow regional traditions. Language loss has accelerated, and the global popularity of a few cultural exports can drown out smaller voices. For every example of cross-cultural creativity, there are many more of local nuance being erased. Attention spans have shortened under the pressure of constant novelty. Video watch times have dropped, and messaging, whether political, commercial, or personal, is tailored for rapid consumption and immediate reaction. This environment makes it difficult for complex ideas or policy proposals to gain traction. Political campaigns now design messages to fit into the shortest possible window, knowing most viewers have moved on before the argument is finished. Digital addiction is increasingly recognized as a social risk. Many users check their devices dozens of times a day and report anxiety when unable to access their feeds. App design borrows from behavioral psychology to keep people engaged for as long as possible. The depletion of attention and the erosion of offline community ties have become as significant as the resource constraints anticipated in older collapse models. Metrics for social cohesion and cultural health show declines that outpace the worst-case projections of earlier models. The original researchers understood that cultural stress could accelerate collapse, but they could not have predicted how digital mediation would intensify every negative trend. Social institutions that once provided stability, schools, churches, unions, now compete with platform algorithms that shape behavior more directly and pervasively. The cumulative effect is a society where fragmentation and distraction are the norm, and where the ability to coordinate on shared problems is diminished. As priorities shift and collective focus narrows, the question becomes not just what we are losing, but what we are choosing to pursue instead. Modern absurdities collapse speedrun tactics. Modern absurdities play out most visibly in how resources and attention are allocated. The billionaire space race, for example, has become a symbol of misplaced priorities. In 2025, Blue Origin celebrated its first successful orbital launch, and SpaceX completed well over 100 launches in a single year. These achievements are framed as milestones for humanity, yet each spaceflight emits nearly 100 times more CO2 per passenger than a standard commercial flight. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of people still lack access to clean water, and the United Nations continues to warn that restoring forests and wetlands would do more to slow climate change than any rocket launch. The spectacle of billionaires streaming their weightless moments from orbit stands in sharp contrast to the environmental and social crises left unresolved on the ground. The same pattern emerges in corporate technology development. Billions are spent on artificial intelligence that generates viral content and chatbots, while healthcare and climate-focused AI receive a fraction of that investment. Most breakthroughs are aimed at consumer engagement or entertainment, not at solving the underlying problems that threaten stability. There are exceptions. Agricultural AI and supply chain optimization have made some progress, but these advances are sidelined by the race to create ever more addictive digital products. The faith in technological solutionism persists, with the hope that innovation will somehow resolve crises without requiring systemic change. Consumer culture reinforces these trends. The luxury market continues to expand, with the wealthiest fraction of society driving most of the growth. High-end goods and experiences are promoted as necessities, while public infrastructure and essential services deteriorate. Smartphone upgrades and fast fashion epitomize planned obsolescence. Over 92 million tons of clothing waste are generated each year, and electronic waste continues to climb as devices are discarded for marginal improvements. The system rewards disposability and rapid turnover, prioritizing novelty over durability. Media and entertainment further fragment collective focus. The average person spends hours each day cycling through short-form videos, news snippets, and algorithm-driven feeds. Streaming platforms and social media optimize for engagement, not understanding, encouraging rapid consumption of content at the expense of sustained attention. This environment makes it harder for society to grapple with complex, long-term challenges, as public discourse is shaped by viral moments rather than thoughtful debate. Corporate practices continue to externalize costs. A handful of multinational companies are responsible for the majority of global deforestation, often while promoting sustainability in their marketing. Mining for rare earth minerals, essential for electronics and renewable energy, leaves behind environmental damage in regions with the least capacity for remediation. The logic is consistent: maximize short-term returns, shift risks elsewhere, and maintain a veneer of progress. Technological optimism remains a dominant narrative. Fusion energy and carbon capture are held up as future solutions, but remain far from commercial viability. Existing technologies, like renewables and regenerative agriculture, could address many urgent problems if implemented at scale, yet they struggle for funding and attention compared to high-profile ventures like Mars colonization. The original MIT scenarios allowed for technology to mitigate collapse, but only if it was deployed strategically and equitably. The pursuit of space colonization encapsulates the broader mentality. The technical challenges of surviving on Mars mirror problems already unsolved on Earth: clean air, water, and sustainable food. Instead of solving these issues for billions of people now, resources are directed toward hypothetical futures on other planets. This approach reflects a form of denial, where the fantasy of escape substitutes for meaningful action in the present. Short-term thinking permeates economic and political decision-making. Quarterly profits and election cycles dominate, even as the consequences of inaction accumulate. Products are designed to be replaced, not repaired. Infrastructure is neglected in favor of immediate returns. The pace of consumption and disposal accelerates, with little regard for the long-term impacts. Efforts to prevent collapse exist, but they struggle to compete with the allure of spectacle and convenience. Climate funding falls short of scientific recommendations, urban planning remains car-centric, and agriculture continues to degrade soil despite available alternatives. The solutions are known, but they lack the visibility and excitement of technological stunts or luxury consumption. The interaction of these trends creates a feedback loop. Space exploration distracts from climate priorities, AI hype pulls resources away from infrastructure, and consumerism accelerates resource depletion. Even well-intentioned innovations often reinforce the underlying dynamics. What emerges is not just a failure to address collapse, but an acceleration, a kind of speedrun, where modern society races toward the very outcomes it claims to fear. This pattern is not lost on observers. Sustainability reports and corporate promises begin to resemble the proclamations of past empires as they neared decline. The parallels are imperfect, but the recurring theme is clear. When faced with mounting challenges, elites invest in escape or distraction rather than repair. The warning signs are visible, yet the response is often to double down on the very behaviors that undermine resilience. As these contradictions intensify, the role of digital platforms becomes even more significant. The same systems that drive consumption and distraction now shape global narratives and influence geopolitics in real time. TikTok geopolitics and ancient Rome comparisons. TikTok's influence now extends far beyond entertainment, shaping both geopolitics and cultural identities at a pace previous generations could not have imagined. Social media platforms have become tools for states to broadcast narratives, shape perceptions, and mobilize public opinion across borders. Government agencies curate behind-the-scenes content, while meme-driven campaigns reach audiences untouched by traditional diplomacy. The U.S. State Department maintains verified TikTok accounts to promote Western perspectives, while Chinese officials highlight their own achievements. News consumption has shifted to social snippets, outpacing long-form journalism and compressing complex issues into formats that maximize engagement over understanding. Surveys show that most of Gen Z now encounters foreign policy and global news through short-form social media, not legacy media or official reports. The shift in attention spans has changed how societies process political and social issues. The average TikTok video must capture interest in seconds or risk being ignored. Political messaging adapts, favoring viral slogans over substantive debate, since algorithms reward simplicity and emotional punch. Legislatures often gridlock over basic tasks, reflecting a broader crisis in governance that cannot keep pace with the speed of digital communication. Policy briefings are now condensed into bullet points, and legislative staff spend far less time on in-depth analysis than a decade ago. When comparing today's trajectory to the decline of ancient Rome, the differences in speed and scale are stark. Rome's descent from peak to collapse stretched over centuries, with slow-moving crises in administration, infrastructure, and economy. Modern civilization, by contrast, faces the risk of unraveling in a matter of decades. MIT's limits to growth model anticipated that the complexity and interconnectedness of modern systems would make them more vulnerable to rapid breakdowns. Where Roman roads and grain shipments failed gradually, today's global supply chains can be disrupted overnight by a cyberattack or a single point of failure. Institutional memory faces new threats in the digital age. Romans relied on parchment and stone, vulnerable to fire but able to endure for centuries. Today, digital files risk becoming unreadable within years as formats change or companies discontinue support. Important government records can vanish when proprietary software is abandoned. The preservation of knowledge now depends on corporate priorities and the viability of cloud storage, fragile foundations compared to the carved laws of antiquity. Technological dependence introduces vulnerabilities the Romans never imagined. Their aqueducts required only basic maintenance and could last generations. Modern infrastructure, from water systems to power grids, depends on constant digital oversight and is exposed to cyber threats. Researchers have demonstrated that a single coordinated cyberattack could disable essential services across entire regions. Systems expected to last decades may become obsolete or insecure in just a few years. Parallels with Rome are clear. Both societies struggle with overextension, wealth disparity, and environmental pressures. But Rome's decline played out during a period of relative climate stability, while today's crises are intensified by rapid environmental shifts. Roman elites competed in the circus. Today's billionaires race for space. Public works in the late empire persisted, but now infrastructure projects stall in political deadlock. The spread of information has also accelerated. Roman messengers took weeks to cross the empire, slowing the pace of rumor and misinformation. Now, false claims can reach millions in minutes, while corrections struggle to keep up. A single viral post can shape public opinion before official sources respond, undermining trust and complicating crisis response. Globalization and digital media have compressed cultural change. Rome integrated new cultures over centuries. Social media now drives abrupt cultural shifts and backlash. Traditional customs can vanish within a generation, replaced by global trends. Linguists warn that a significant share of the world's languages could disappear by the end of the century, a rate unseen since the upheavals of the early modern era. Financial and military risks have also accelerated. Rome's monetary crises unfolded over generations as coins were slowly debased. Today's financial systems can collapse in hours if digital transactions fail, and cryptocurrency markets routinely wipe out billions in a day. Military mobilization, once a matter of months, now happens in real time, with drone strikes and cyber operations conducted at the speed of data. Administrative decay follows a similar pattern. Roman bureaucracy became inefficient over centuries. Modern governments have reached similar dysfunction in decades, with routine tasks bogged down by procedural hurdles and compliance demands. Infrastructure projects that once took years now face endless reviews and delays. Rome's collapse was regional, allowing neighboring societies to persist. Today's interconnected world means that a failure in one domain can cascade globally. If supply chains break, the consequences are immediate and widespread. Cultural and economic shocks now reverberate across continents, not just within a single empire. Entertainment has evolved as well. Roman spectacles distracted from decline. Now, algorithmically generated content fulfills the same function, keeping audiences engaged but rarely informed or satisfied. The attention economy rewards constant stimulation, making it harder for society to focus on long-term challenges. These comparisons highlight how digital systems and global connectivity have compressed the timeline of decline. The MIT models captured the general risks, but could not anticipate the speed or the mechanisms of today's collapse dynamics. As political, economic, and cultural pressures accelerate, the question is whether technological innovation can provide solutions, or if it simply adds new layers of risk. Technological innovations, savior or distraction. Technological innovation stands at the center of modern hopes and anxieties. The narrative is familiar. New inventions will rescue society from the brink, just as they have in the past. But when measured against the scale and speed of current crises, the numbers behind these advances reveal a more complicated reality. Renewable energy is often cited as the clearest sign of progress. Solar panel efficiency has improved, and costs have dropped dramatically since 2010, with global renewable capacity growing each year. Yet, renewables still supply a small fraction of total energy demand, and fossil fuel use continues to rise. Even with major policy pushes like the Inflation Reduction Act, the pace of wind and solar installations lags behind what climate targets require. Energy demand increases faster than clean energy can be deployed, and tripling installation rates, a necessity for meeting climate goals, remains out of reach. The result is a widening gap between what technology can provide and what is actually needed. Carbon capture and storage, often presented as a safety valve for emissions, illustrates the scale of the challenge. Current facilities remove well under 1% of global CO2 emissions, and the costs remain high, making large-scale adoption unlikely in the near term. Most projects serve to prolong oil extraction rather than meaningfully reduce atmospheric carbon. The optimistic assumptions of the MIT Comprehensive Technology scenario, where carbon capture would scale rapidly, have not materialized. The technology exists, but its impact remains negligible. Artificial intelligence is another area where potential and reality diverge. AI models now drive everything from logistics to content moderation, and proposals for AI governance multiply each year. The EU, China, and the US all have frameworks in place, but enforcement remains inconsistent and often symbolic. Meanwhile, the energy demands of AI are rising sharply. Training a single large language model can emit as much CO2 as hundreds of cross-country flights. The paradox is clear. The tools designed to optimize energy use and monitor environmental harm risk, accelerating the very problems they are meant to solve. Scaling up these technologies exposes further constraints. The minerals needed for batteries, wind turbines, and solar panels are concentrated in a handful of countries, introducing new geopolitical risks. Mining for these resources often comes with significant environmental costs, and the sheer volume required for a global transition is staggering. Studies suggest that meeting electric vehicle targets alone would require mining more metals in the next 3 decades than humanity has extracted throughout all of history. Supply chains strain under these demands, and the risk of bottlenecks grows as more sectors compete for the same finite materials. MIT model's most optimistic scenario relied on technological advances, scaling at a rate far above what has been achieved. In reality, deployment rates for renewables, storage, and other solutions remain closer to 4% annually, enough to generate hopeful headlines, but not enough to change the overall trajectory. Even the KPMG update found that in a best-case technology scenario, rising costs eventually crowd out other essential services like food production and healthcare. Natural solutions, such as protecting forests and restoring wetlands, continue to outperform engineered fixes at a fraction of the cost. Mangroves, for example, sequester carbon at rates far higher than most technological interventions, yet receive minimal funding compared to unproven machines and speculative projects. The UN and climate scientists repeatedly stress the importance of these approaches, but they struggle for attention in a landscape dominated by high-tech promises. The deeper problem is one of timing. Technologies that could make a difference often need decades to mature and scale, while the crises they are meant to address unfold on much shorter timelines. Fusion energy might become viable by mid-century, but emissions need to peak within a few years. AI could optimize resource use, but only if deployed quickly and equitably. The vaccine response during the pandemic showed what rapid mobilization can achieve, but climate and resource challenges lack the same sense of immediate threat. Across sectors, the pattern is consistent. Technological solutions advance, but not at the speed or scale required. Progress is linear, problems compound exponentially. The tools to address collapse exist in theory, but coordination, investment, and behavioral change lag behind. As a result, the promise of technology as a savior remains unfulfilled, and the risk grows that innovation will simply document the unfolding crisis in ever greater detail. These limitations highlight a critical point. The interplay between technological progress and systemic stress is not straightforward. The way these forces feed back into each other shapes the future as much as any single breakthrough. Feedback loops in the modern age. Modern feedback loops have become defining features of our era, shaping how crises emerge and spread. The MIT World 3 model first identified how interconnected variables, population, resources, pollution, and industrial output could reinforce each other, but today's systems reveal even more intricate and accelerated dynamics. Consider the example of Arctic melting. As sea ice shrinks, the Earth's surface reflects less sunlight, which leads to faster warming. This warming thaws permafrost, releasing methane, a potent greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere, which then accelerates climate change further. This single loop illustrates how an initial change can trigger a cascade of effects, each amplifying the original problem. The pace and intensity of these feedbacks are greater than what early models anticipated, making outcomes harder to predict and control. Economic inequality now operates as a powerful amplifier. As wealth becomes more concentrated, those with resources gain greater influence over policy, often shaping regulations to protect their interests. This further entrenches inequality and erodes the resilience of the overall economy. When large segments of the population are left behind, social unrest becomes more likely, leading to instability that disrupts growth and investment. The cycle repeats, with economic instability feeding back into deeper divides, and each turn of the loop makes it more difficult to reverse course. Political polarization is another area where feedback loops intensify modern challenges. As societies become more divided, trust in institutions declines. This distrust leads to legislative gridlock and a breakdown in effective governance. When governments fail to address pressing issues, the public grows even more disillusioned, reinforcing polarization and making compromise nearly impossible. The result is a self-reinforcing loop that weakens the ability to respond to complex problems, a dynamic that now moves much faster than in the past due to digital communication and social media. Social media platforms themselves are engines of feedback. Algorithms prioritize content that provokes strong emotional responses, amplifying divisive or sensational material. As users engage with this content, the platforms further optimize for similar posts, deepening polarization and spreading misinformation. The constant connectivity and barrage of updates create a sense of urgency and stress, eroding attention spans and making it more difficult for nuanced information to gain traction. This cycle not only shapes public opinion, but also influences real-world events, as viral misinformation can spark protests or panic before facts are verified. Resource depletion introduces yet another layer of complexity. The extraction and consumption of critical resources, whether water, minerals, or fossil fuels, can push natural systems past tipping points. Unlike the gradual declines imagined in early models, modern resource shortages often arrive suddenly, with cascading failures across food production, energy supply, and economic stability. When one system falters, it can set off a chain reaction that ripples through others, amplifying the initial disruption. Institutional trust erosion also operates as a feedback loop. Scandals and failures reduce public confidence, which in turn lowers compliance and cooperation. As institutions become less effective, further failures become more likely, reinforcing distrust. This loop undermines the collective capacity to respond to emergencies, whether they are public health crises, environmental disasters, or economic shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how quickly these cycles can escalate, as underinvestment in preparedness led to overwhelmed systems and delayed responses. Pandemic preparedness failures have shown how feedback traps can lock societies into cycles of reaction rather than prevention. Insufficient investment in public health allows outbreaks to grow unchecked, which then diverts resources from future planning. As each crisis passes, the system is left more vulnerable, making it harder to recover and prepare for what comes next. Comparing these dynamics to the original MIT framework reveals that feedback loops today are not only stronger, but also more tightly interconnected. Where earlier models saw loops operating in relative isolation, now a disruption in one domain can rapidly propagate across the globe. A supply chain disruption in one region can drive up prices and trigger inflation elsewhere within weeks. Political scandals, economic shocks, or environmental disasters rarely stay contained. They move through financial markets, digital networks, and public consciousness at unprecedented speeds. Some of these feedbacks now move faster than institutions can respond. Automated trading can trigger market crashes in minutes, and misinformation can circle the globe before corrections are issued. The acceleration of these loops leaves decision-makers struggling to keep pace, widening the gap between emerging threats and effective responses. While some positive feedback loops exist, such as the rapid adoption of renewable energy lowering costs and encouraging further adoption, these virtuous cycles have yet to outpace the destructive ones. The overall trend is toward greater complexity and higher risk, with many systems approaching or surpassing the thresholds that MIT's original model warned about. Understanding these feedback dynamics is essential for evaluating which paths forward remain open and which are closing rapidly. The next question is whether technological optimism, rooted in the hope that innovation can break or reverse these loops, still holds up under scrutiny. The comprehensive technology scenario. The comprehensive technology scenario, as laid out in the original MIT study, offered a vision of progress where innovation would allow society to sidestep the worst outcomes of unchecked growth. In this model, industrial output would eventually peak and decline, but advances in efficiency and pollution control would soften the landing. Population growth would slow as societies became wealthier and more urban, stabilizing not because of crisis, but through demographic transition. The scenario assumed that technologies such as advanced pollution controls and improved agricultural methods could keep environmental and resource pressures in check, at least for a time. Looking at the present, some aspects of this vision have materialized, while others remain out of reach. Renewable energy stands out as a genuine success. Solar and wind capacity have both expanded rapidly, with solar costs dropping by more than 80% over the past decade and installations doubling every few years. In certain regions, renewables now provide a significant share of electricity, demonstrating that large-scale shifts in energy production are possible when technology, policy, and economics align. These gains show that targeted innovation, backed by sustained investment and supportive regulation, can deliver real progress. However, the shortcomings are just as clear. Carbon capture and storage, a central pillar in the comprehensive technology scenario for managing emissions, has failed to scale. Current facilities capture a fraction of a percent of global CO2 emissions, and the costs remain prohibitively high. The technology exists, but deployment lags far behind what would be needed to meaningfully alter atmospheric carbon trends. The promise that innovation alone could neutralize environmental threats has not been fulfilled, at least not at the pace or scale required. This divide between sectors highlights a deeper challenge. Technologies that align with immediate profit incentives or consumer demand, like personal electronics or digital services, spread rapidly. Those that require coordinated infrastructure, long-term planning, or collective sacrifice, such as grid upgrades or large-scale carbon removal, advance much more slowly. The MIT scenario assumed that society would rationally prioritize the most urgent innovations, but in practice, the path of least resistance often wins out. Policy support remains uneven and fragmented. Some countries have enacted ambitious emissions targets and invested heavily in clean tech, while others remain tied to fossil fuel revenues or lack the resources to make major transitions. This patchwork approach undermines the kind of global coordination the scenario envisioned. Without shared priorities and consistent investment, even the most promising technologies struggle to gain traction beyond isolated successes. Physical and logistical constraints also play a role. For For example, transitioning all vehicles to electric power would require a dramatic expansion of mining for lithium and other critical minerals, an undertaking that poses its own environmental and social risks. Upgrading power grids to accommodate intermittent renewables and new demand from electric vehicles or industry is a massive, ongoing challenge. These realities impose limits that the original scenario, with its focus on technological possibility, tended to overlook. When measured against MIT's original parameters, the comprehensive technology scenario appears increasingly out of reach. The most recent KPMG analysis found that, even under optimistic assumptions, the costs of maintaining advanced technologies could eventually crowd out spending on essentials like food production, health care, and education. The gap between what is technically possible and what is politically and economically feasible remains wide. Actual rates of technological deployment, averaging around 4% annually, fall well short of the sustained double-digit growth that would be needed to truly offset the pressures of population and consumption. Renewable energy remains the strongest argument for the potential of the technological path, but even here, absolute fossil fuel use continues to rise as total energy demand grows. The pattern repeats across sectors. Innovations advance, but the underlying problems multiply faster, and the benefits are often unevenly distributed. A key miscalculation in the original scenario was the expectation that societies would implement solutions rationally and proactively. In reality, adoption often follows short-term incentives, market trends, or political cycles rather than long-term necessity. Technologies that could support resilience and sustainability are available, but the collective will to deploy them at scale remains elusive. The comprehensive technology scenario demonstrates that solutions are within reach, but not guaranteed. Progress depends as much on priorities, coordination, and the willingness to act as on the tools themselves. As the evidence mounts that innovation alone may not deliver a soft landing, it becomes necessary to consider other pathways, ones that address not just technology, but the underlying patterns of growth and consumption that drive systemic risk. The stabilized world scenario. A different path was outlined in the MIT study, the stabilized world scenario. Here, the premise is not innovation alone, but a conscious shift in priorities, one where societies choose to slow industrial growth before environmental or resource limits force their hand. The scenario rests on the idea that material consumption can be limited voluntarily, with investments redirected toward health, education, pollution control, and resource efficiency. Rather than maximizing output, the goal is to maintain high levels of human welfare while keeping the use of energy and raw materials within sustainable boundaries. This vision stands apart from business as usual. It calls for a deliberate cap on industrial expansion, paired with large-scale efforts to conserve and restore natural systems. Forest protection and soil restoration offer glimpses of what's possible. In some regions, targeted reforestation projects have reversed erosion and improved local water cycles. China's Green Great Wall has planted billions of trees across degraded land, and certain European countries have seen modest increases in forest cover after decades of decline. Similarly, regenerative agriculture in parts of Africa and Latin America has restored soil fertility and increased yields without expanding farmland. These examples show that change is feasible, but their scale remains too limited to shift global trends. Deforestation in the Amazon and Southeast Asia continues to erase gains elsewhere, and overall, the world is still losing natural carbon sinks faster than they can be rebuilt. Policy efforts reflect a similar pattern. The European Union's recycling targets, aiming for 65% municipal waste recycling by 2035, demonstrate ambition, but implementation lags. As of 2025, EU countries collectively recycle just over 47% of municipal waste, and plastic recycling rates remain much lower. Contamination, lack of infrastructure, and persistent incentives for new material extraction limit progress. Even where policies exist, they rarely address the root drivers of waste: planned obsolescence, cheap disposables, and the absence of extended producer responsibility in most sectors. Renewable energy has made notable advances, with solar and wind capacity expanding rapidly and costs falling. In some countries, renewables now supply a significant share of electricity, and local grid upgrades show that technical barriers can be overcome. However, fossil fuels still account for the vast majority of global energy use, and overall consumption continues to rise. The stabilized world scenario requires not just more renewables, but a managed reduction in total energy demand, something that has yet to occur at any meaningful scale. Culturally, the shift towards sustainability is uneven. In wealthier nations, eco-friendly products and voluntary simplicity trends have gained some traction, but they remain niche compared to mainstream consumption. Surveys show that while a majority of people recognize the risks of environmental decline, only a minority consistently change their behavior. In lower-income countries, immediate needs take precedence, and environmental priorities are often subordinated to economic growth. The original MIT model did not fully address these disparities, and they remain a central challenge to any coordinated stabilization effort. Barriers to implementation are substantial. Industrial lobbying and entrenched interests have weakened or delayed many proposed reforms. Most products are still not designed for disassembly or recycling, and less than 8% of materials globally are cycled back into use. Consumer preferences for low prices and convenience routinely outweigh stated concerns about sustainability. The scenario assumes a rapid, coordinated shift in values and priorities, something no large society has achieved without significant external shocks. When measured against the criteria for stabilization, current trends fall short. The KPMG update found that the world is least aligned with this scenario, and that the window for a gradual, orderly transition is closing. Growth dependencies are built into pension systems, financial markets, and political expectations. Attempts at stabilization have produced pockets of success, but not the systemic change required to alter the overall trajectory. Some elements of the stabilized world scenario have proven technically feasible. Community energy projects, urban mining, and producer responsibility laws all demonstrate that alternatives to business as usual exist. But adoption remains fragmented, and the scale is insufficient to counteract global pressures. The main obstacle is not a lack of solutions, but the absence of coordinated will to pursue them at the necessary speed. The MIT team envisioned a world where societies would act before reaching hard limits, using foresight and cooperation to avoid crisis. The reality is that most stabilization measures are only seriously considered after warning signs have become unavoidable. As a result, the prospect of a voluntary, smooth transition to sustainability now appears remote. This gap between what is possible and what is practiced sets the stage for a different outcome, one that the MIT model regarded as the most likely if existing trends continue. The business as usual scenario. Against this backdrop, the business as usual scenario from MIT's 1972 study stands out for its stark clarity. This scenario assumed that society would continue to prioritize short-term gains and industrial expansion, with little appetite for major policy shifts or deep technological breakthroughs. The model's 5 core variables, population, industrial output, food production, available resources, and pollution, were tracked in detail, and recent KPMG analysis confirms that each still aligns closely with the BAU2 variant. The pattern is clear. Industrial output rises, resource extraction intensifies, and pollution accumulates, but these gains are short-lived before decline sets in. One example is global material consumption. Annual use now exceeds 100 billion tons, more than double what it was 3 decades ago. This surge is matched by a rise in waste, with plastic production and disposal outpacing any meaningful advances in recycling. Only about 9% of plastics are successfully recycled, and the rest contribute to mounting environmental pressures. The MIT model anticipated this escalation in disposable consumerism, and current trends mirror those projections with remarkable fidelity. Resource depletion is another area where the scenario's warnings have become reality. While some fossil fuel reserves have been extended through new extraction techniques, critical minerals essential for technology and energy transitions, such as lithium and cobalt, face growing shortages. The push for renewable infrastructure has led to a situation where, over the next 30 years, more metals may be mined than in all previous human history. Meanwhile, water scarcity accelerates. Major aquifers are being drained faster than they can recharge, and soil loss continues at rates far beyond natural renewal. These developments reinforce the scenario's prediction that resource constraints would become a defining feature of the coming decades. Pollution growth, too, has outpaced even the original forecasts. Atmospheric CO2 levels have reached 425 parts per million, a figure that MIT's model associated with the mid-2030s. Microplastics are now found in human tissue, and chemical pollutants have created dead zones in oceans and disrupted biological systems at a global scale. The exponential rise in pollution was a cornerstone of the business as usual scenario, and today's data suggests that reality may even exceed those expectations. Short-term thinking remains deeply embedded in decision-making. Corporations continue to maximize quarterly returns, and political leaders focus on election cycles rather than long-term infrastructure or environmental health. Consumer culture rewards instant rewards and rapid turnover, with little regard for durability or sustainability. The MIT team originally assumed that rational adjustments would eventually prevail, but instead, the tendency to reward immediate profit has become more entrenched. Even in the face of repeated climate and supply chain shocks, the default is to return to previous patterns as quickly as possible. Policy inertia compounds these issues. Climate agreements often lack binding enforcement, and recycling remains mostly voluntary or underfunded. Subsidies for fossil fuels still outpace those for renewables, reinforcing old habits. The original scenario did not fully anticipate how actively some industries would resist reform, yet this resistance has become a defining feature of the present era. Corporate practices reinforce the cycle. Planned obsolescence, aggressive marketing, and lobbying against environmental regulations all serve to perpetuate unsustainable consumption. Oil companies and other major players have long known about environmental risks but have invested in misinformation to delay action. This goes beyond the passive neglect MIT imagined, making the current trajectory even harder to reverse. Cultural attitudes also play a role. While surveys show growing awareness of environmental risks, most people remain reluctant to change established habits or accept lower levels of material comfort. Status symbols and convenience still outweigh efficiency and durability in most purchasing decisions. The expectation that societies would shift priorities in response to mounting evidence has not materialized. Instead, a gap persists between what is known and what is acted upon. According to KPMG's independent review, current global metrics show nearly 80% alignment with the business as usual scenario. While population growth is slightly below original projections, per capita consumption and pollution are higher, and industrial output follows the expected curve. The BAU2 path, where pollution, rather than resource scarcity, drives the decline, now appears to be the closest match for today's world. The timeline, if anything, is compressed. MIT's model suggested the steepest declines would begin around 2040, but several indicators, such as pollution impacts on food production and economic instability from climate events, are surfacing earlier than expected. The pattern of compounding crises is now visible in real time, and the feedback loops that drive breakdowns are more deeply embedded than the original researchers foresaw. MIT warned current paths risk gradual breakdowns across systems, and the evidence increasingly supports that view. As these dynamics intensify, the question shifts from whether the model's predictions will unfold to how much time remains to change course. The years ahead will test whether societies can recognize these warning signs and take action before the window for meaningful intervention closes. Critical junctures, 2025-2040. From 2025 to 2040, the timeline outlined by MIT for peak instability becomes the central reference point. This period is not just another stretch of years, but a convergence of critical junctures, where demographic, environmental, economic, and political forces interact more intensely than at any time in recent history. The KPMG update confirms that empirical data now tracks closest to the business-as-usual and comprehensive technology scenarios, both of which signal that uninterrupted growth is not sustainable, and that declines in industrial output, food production, and human welfare are likely within this century. The next decade, in particular, matches the warning period MIT identified for when system-wide stresses would begin to reach their highest levels. Population and emissions trends illustrate this convergence. The global population is projected to peak around 2040, with shifts in age structure already putting pressure on both developed and developing economies. Fertility rates continue to fall in higher-income countries, leading to aging workforces and potential labor shortages, while youth unemployment remains stubbornly high across much of the global south. At the same time, global greenhouse gas emissions have yet to peak, despite international pledges. The Paris Agreement remains the most prominent global effort to limit warming, but current implementation falls short of the targets needed to avoid dangerous climate thresholds. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which aims to conserve 30% of land and sea by 2030, faces similar obstacles, ambitious on paper, but hampered by slow execution and persistent funding gaps. Resource constraints are tightening. The supply of key minerals such as lithium and cobalt, essential for renewable energy technologies, is forecasted to fall short by the mid-2030s if extraction and recycling do not accelerate. Freshwater systems are under immediate strain, with the Colorado River and major aquifers unable to meet rising demand. Soil degradation continues to erode the foundation of global agriculture, and the world's capacity to restore these resources lags behind the rate of depletion. These resource bottlenecks threaten to undermine both economic stability and the technological solutions intended to address environmental challenges. Climate tipping points add another layer of risk. The loss of Arctic sea ice, thawing of permafrost, and the approach of a dieback threshold in the Amazon all represent nonlinear changes that could rapidly accelerate environmental decline. These regime shifts are not gradual. They can unfold over years or even months, making adaptation difficult. Marine ecosystems, already stressed by warming and acidification, face the risk of cascading failures that could disrupt food webs and coastal economies. The MIT model anticipated gradual feedbacks, but current science suggests some of these tipping points may arrive sooner than initially projected. Economic indicators reflect mounting fragility. Forecasts from Deloitte and other major analysts show slowing growth, rising debt levels, and increased risk of recession if trade tensions or interest rates spike. Global debt now stands at more than 3 times world GDP, limiting the ability of governments to respond to shocks. In the business-as-usual scenario, economic contraction was expected to follow drops in industrial output caused by resource constraints. Today, financial vulnerabilities, such as high leverage and weak safety nets, could trigger downturns even before physical shortages become acute. Political instability is also rising. The Preventive Priorities Survey for 2025 highlights an unprecedented number of high-likelihood, high-impact contingencies, from ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East to tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Domestic polarization continues to erode governance capacities, with legislatures struggling to pass budgets or respond to crises. The MIT model saw political stress as a secondary effect of resource and economic decline, but in the present, political fractures may arrive first, amplifying other risks. Despite these challenges, there are signs that targeted interventions can make a difference. Some countries have exceeded expectations in renewable energy adoption, and there is growing momentum behind biodiversity protection and climate finance. Younger generations express greater willingness to adopt sustainable lifestyles, though large-scale behavioral change remains limited. The stabilized world scenario, where societies voluntarily cap growth and reinvest in sustainability, remains technically possible, but KPMG's analysis shows alignment with this path is low without much stronger coordination. When measured against MIT's original framework, most interventions show only partial effectiveness. Technological solutions face barriers in scaling and resource supply. Policy agreements often lack enforcement and lag in implementation. Consumer and cultural shifts are slow to take hold, and entrenched economic interests resist change. The comprehensive technology scenario currently scores higher than the stabilized world on alignment, but both fall short of what would be needed to fully avoid declines. The original models did not predict collapse as a single event, but as a process of compounding failures across interconnected systems. Recent data suggests these thresholds are being approached more quickly than expected, with some indicators already surpassing levels anticipated for 2040. The coming decade represents a narrowing window where proactive measures could still change the larger trajectory. As the world moves through this period of heightened risk, the effectiveness of interventions will depend on recognizing root causes and acting across all levels of society. The next step is to examine what strategies remain viable for preventing collapse, and which tools offer the most promise for addressing the underlying drivers identified by MIT and confirmed by recent analysis. Collapse prevention strategies. Addressing collapse prevention means focusing on what actually works at scale, rather than assembling a wish list of ideal policies. The MIT scenarios and recent KPMG updates both highlight that only a handful of interventions have the leverage to shift our current trajectory. Among these, carbon pricing and biodiversity protection stand out as the most effective tools for changing systemic incentives and restoring planetary stability. Carbon pricing, especially in the form of a robust carbon tax, is the clearest example of a policy that can realign markets with climate goals. Sweden's experience shows that a well-designed carbon tax can drive emissions down by 25% since 1995, while still allowing the economy to expand by over 70%. Yet, globally, carbon prices remain too low to have meaningful impact. The average sits at around $6 per ton, far below the $75 per ton threshold most economists agree is needed to shift energy investment away from fossil fuels. Without stronger and more widespread carbon pricing, fossil fuel subsidies and market inertia, will continue to undermine renewable energy adoption and keep emissions on a growth path. Biodiversity protection is another high-impact strategy, not only for preserving species, but for maintaining ecosystem services that underpin food security, water supply, and climate regulation. Success stories exist. Targeted reforestation projects in China, for example, have reversed erosion and improved water cycles across vast regions. The European Union's biodiversity policies, while imperfect, have helped stabilize some forested areas and led to modest increases in protected land. However, these gains are still dwarfed by the scale of ongoing loss elsewhere. Deforestation in the Amazon and Southeast Asia continues to erase global progress. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework sets ambitious targets for 2030, but implementation remains slow and funding gaps persist. Without rapid scaling of these efforts, the world will continue to lose natural carbon sinks and resilience against environmental shocks. Technological innovation remains essential, but the focus must be on rapid deployment of proven solutions rather than speculative bets. The swift development and rollout of COVID-19 vaccines prove that societies can act decisively when motivated by clear and immediate risk. A similar level of urgency is needed for renewable energy and regenerative agriculture. Solar and wind installations continue to grow, yet they still supply a minority of global energy, and rates of deployment fall short of what's required to meet climate targets. Carbon capture, while often discussed, remains a marginal contributor due to high costs and slow adoption. The lesson is clear: technology can help, but only if paired with strong policy incentives and broad public support. Cultural change is the most challenging, yet perhaps the most important aspect of collapse prevention. Human psychology tends to prioritize immediate comfort and convenience over long-term survival. This is evident in consumer behavior, where sustainability is valued in theory, but often loses out to price and ease. Shifting these defaults requires more than awareness campaigns. It calls for restructuring incentives within education, marketing, and media to reward behaviors that support resilience and sustainability. Progress here is slow, but necessary for any systemic solution to take hold. Governance reform is also critical. Existing institutions often struggle to move beyond short-term interests, and political polarization undermines the ability to enact far-reaching reforms. Local initiatives sometimes succeed where national governments falter. Denmark's wind cooperatives, for example, have built significant renewable capacity through community ownership, demonstrating that bottom-up approaches can scale when supported by policy frameworks. Still, the challenge is to extend these successes beyond isolated cases and integrate them into broader national and global systems. Individual and community actions contribute to resilience, but are most effective when aligned with systemic changes. Local projects, such as rural revitalization and community-led conservation, have shown that smaller populations using regional resources can adapt more flexibly than large, centralized systems. However, these models remain limited in reach and require coordination with larger policy shifts to have significant impact. Ultimately, collapse prevention depends on society's willingness to prioritize long-term survival over short-term gain. The next decade represents a narrowing window for coordinated action. If the necessary changes are not made soon, the opportunity for an orderly transition will close, leaving societies to adapt reactively to intensifying crises. For individuals and communities, this means rethinking strategies for resilience, not just at the policy level, but in everyday decisions about resources, skills, and support networks. Personal finance in a collapsing society. Personal finance takes on a different character when the long-term stability of society is no longer a given. In an environment where systemic shocks are more likely, the emphasis shifts from maximizing returns to protecting assets and maintaining access to essentials. Traditional investment advice, focused on stocks, retirement accounts, and digital wealth, offers less reassurance if markets become volatile or institutions unreliable. Asset protection becomes a primary concern. Diversifying beyond paper assets is essential. Gold and silver coins have a long history of retaining value through currency crises and periods of inflation, as noted by KPMG's asset analysis. While their prices fluctuate, they tend to hold purchasing power when fiat currencies lose credibility. Land with productive capacity, whether for growing food or providing rental income, remains one of the most resilient forms of wealth. Even a small plot can offer food security and a place to retreat if urban supply chains break down. Physical goods with practical uses, such as tools, water filters, and durable clothing, also gain importance. These assets are less vulnerable to devaluation and can be directly useful in barter or trade. Inflation hedging is another crucial strategy. In times of accelerating inflation, the value of cash erodes quickly. Real estate traditionally serves as a hedge, but its utility depends on local conditions and ongoing demand. Commodities, especially those immediately usable like food, fuel, or building materials, can provide more direct protection. Tangible assets that people need regardless of economic conditions tend to retain value. Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, can offer some defense, but their effectiveness relies on the stability of the issuing government. Cryptocurrencies can be volatile, and while some are designed for practical use, their resilience in a crisis remains uncertain. The most reliable hedge, however, is investing in skills and goods that remain valuable regardless of currency. Medical training, for example, consistently holds value in any scenario. Building a local economy increases financial resilience as larger systems become less predictable. Supporting local businesses, joining community-supported agriculture, and participating in farmers' markets help reduce dependence on distant supply chains. Developing relationships with people who provide essential goods, mechanics, farmers, healthcare workers, creates a network of mutual support. Barter networks and local currencies, such as scrip or time banks, have a track record of functioning during periods when national currencies falter. These systems work best when established before a crisis, so participating early is key. Skill development is another form of wealth. Practical abilities, first aid, gardening, mechanical repair, and basic construction become economic assets in a disrupted environment. Unlike credentials that depend on institutional recognition, these skills have immediate value within communities. They can be exchanged for goods and services or used to solve problems directly. For younger people, prioritizing skill building over accumulating credentials that may lose value is a sound strategy. Community support systems offer a buffer against shocks that individuals cannot absorb alone. Mutual aid networks, neighborhood preparedness groups, and cooperative projects can pool resources and expertise. These networks are especially important for sharing tools, organizing emergency response, and assisting vulnerable members. Social capital, trust, and cooperation often proves more valuable than financial capital during times of crisis. Sustainable living practices help insulate households from external disruptions. Growing food, collecting rainwater, and learning to repair or repurpose goods reduce reliance on fragile infrastructure. These habits lower living costs and build self-sufficiency, making it easier to weather periods of scarcity or uncertainty. Alternative economic models, such as time banks and local exchange trading systems, provide additional resilience. By facilitating exchanges outside the traditional cash economy, these systems keep goods and services circulating even when money is scarce. They also foster stronger community ties, which become critical as broader systems weaken. Practical preparation involves keeping some cash on hand in small denominations, maintaining a supply of shelf-stable food and water, and safeguarding important documents in physical form. Basic tools for home repair and personal safety are also worth acquiring. These measures offer flexibility and a margin of safety when disruptions occur. Ultimately, financial resilience in a collapsing society means shifting focus from abstract wealth to concrete utility. Tangible assets, practical skills, and strong relationships provide more security than digital balances or speculative investments. The MIT models suggest that collapse is rarely uniform. Some regions and sectors fare better than others. Personal finance strategies should reflect this variability, emphasizing adaptability and readiness for a range of outcomes. The strategies outlined here address the individual level, but the larger picture is far from settled. As society moves through this period of instability, multiple futures remain possible. Some systems may falter while others persist, and not all outcomes lead to total collapse. Understanding the range of alternative scenarios is the next step in preparing for what comes after stability fades. Alternative future scenarios. When considering what comes next, it's clear that the future does not unfold along a single, predetermined path. Instead, a range of alternative scenarios emerges from the interplay of environmental, economic, technological, and social forces. Two contrasting possibilities are especially prominent in research and modeling: the business as usual 2, BAU2 scenario, and the comprehensive technology, CT scenario. Each represents a distinct set of assumptions about what drives change and what outcomes are possible. The BAU2 scenario projects a future where societies remain focused on short-term economic growth, with little success in shifting away from fossil fuels or curbing pollution. Here, key systems, industrial output, food production, population, and resource use continue to rise until environmental limits trigger a series of breakdowns. The most distinctive feature of BAU2 is that pollution, rather than outright resource depletion, becomes the main driver of decline. As waste accumulates and ecosystems destabilize, the capacity to support large populations and complex economies erodes. This scenario does not imply a uniform global collapse. Instead, it points to a patchwork of partial breakdowns. Some regions or sectors experience severe disruptions, while others maintain a degree of stability. For example, areas with strong local food systems or access to clean water may fare better, while regions more exposed to climate risks or dependent on global supply chains could see sharper declines. Demographic imbalances, such as rapidly aging populations in developed countries and persistent youth unemployment in others, further complicate recovery and adaptation. In contrast, the comprehensive technology scenario imagines a world where rapid innovation and coordinated investment in sustainable technologies stave off the worst outcomes. This path assumes that renewables, energy storage, and efficiency improvements scale up fast enough to meet growing demand, while breakthroughs in carbon capture and circular economy practices help close the gap between consumption and environmental limits. Yet even in this more optimistic model, progress comes with trade-offs. The costs of deploying new technologies at scale can crowd out other essential investments, such as food production and public health, leading to new forms of vulnerability. The feasibility of this scenario depends not only on technical breakthroughs, but also on unprecedented levels of policy support and global cooperation, conditions that remain rare in current trends. Between these two poles, a range of intermediate outcomes is possible. Managed decline scenarios, for instance, involve societies deliberately reducing consumption and prioritizing sustainability before ecological limits force abrupt change. Some nations experiment with degrowth or circular economy policies, but so far, these efforts remain limited in scope and impact. Societal transformation could also take the form of new governance models, shifts in cultural values, or the rise of local economies focused on resilience rather than growth. Adaptation success stories, like drought-resistant agriculture, mutual aid networks, or rapid vaccine deployment, demonstrate that constructive change is possible, but these examples have yet to scale enough to shift global trajectories. Post-collapse rebuilding is another possible future, where societies that endure the initial wave of breakdowns gradually reorganize around new priorities. Regions that maintain social cohesion, practical skills, and knowledge bases may recover more quickly, while others face prolonged instability. The process of rebuilding could lead to new economic systems, governance structures, or cultural norms that prioritize resilience over expansion. Unexpected positive developments, such as breakthroughs in renewable energy or shifts in public values, could still alter the trajectory. However, most evidence suggests that without significant changes in direction, the world is more likely to follow a path resembling BAU2. Scoring the probabilities, current trends indicate a higher likelihood of partial or uneven collapse, with the comprehensive technology scenario and stabilized world scenario remaining less probable based on present-day policy and behavioral indicators. The MIT models have endured not because they predicted details, but because they identified the structural patterns that shape how complex societies respond to stress. As the evidence accumulates, it becomes clear that the choices made in the next decade will determine which of these scenarios becomes reality. The signals are increasingly difficult to ignore, and the data points to a future where the consequences of inaction will be felt across all systems. The evidence points to a clear pattern. Global trends continue to match the MIT business-as-usual scenario, with pollution, resource strain, and declining natural systems intensifying. Research shows that immediate action is needed to avoid the projected declines in industrial output, food production, and overall stability within the next 2 decades. This is not a matter of distant speculation. The next decade is critical for shifting away from the current trajectory. Engage with local community initiatives or join policy advocacy, efforts that support emissions reductions and biodiversity protection. Individual and collective choices now will determine whether we stabilize our systems or allow the collapse scenario to play out.